Welcome to Catholic Theological Union. I am Sister Barbara Reed, President of CTU, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Holocaust Remembrance Lecture Series. For those of you who may be new to CTU, we were founded in 1968 in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, and we have been very committed since our founding to interreligious dialogue, especially through our Catholic Jewish Studies and our Catholic Muslim Studies programs. Under the leadership of Father John Polakowski and Rabbi Chaim Perlmutter, two of our founding faculty members, the Catholic Jewish Studies program became a hallmark of CTU. And we treasure the deep and lasting friendships that have been formed between CTU and our Jewish partners in the last more than 5 decades. In 2001, CTU established a chair in Jewish Studies made possible by a most generous gift of Lester and Renee Crown and Patrick and Shirley Ryan, which has been held since 2014 by Dr. Malka Zeiger-Simkovich, along with her directorship of the Catholic Jewish Studies program. Dr. Simkovich holds an MA in Hebrew Bible from Harvard University and a BA in Bible Studies and Music Theory from Stern College of Yeshiva University. She earned her PhD in Second Temple Judaism from Brandeis University. In May 2019, Malka initiated the Holocaust Remembrance at CTU, which includes 3 components. First, a lecture on the background of the Holocaust. Second, an in-person visit to the Illinois Holocaust Museum. And third, a talk given by a Holocaust survivor with questions and answers. This year, however, we're doing things a bit differently. Last week, we were honored to have Rabbi Yehiel Pupko present a lecture on the background of the Holocaust. And tonight, we are pleased to offer a second lecture by Michael Soffer on the topic of Holocaust education in public school systems. Our virtual tour of the Illinois Holocaust Museum was last Sunday. I invite you to visit our website, ctu.edu, for more information about our programming. Whether a long time or a new friend, we hope you will join us often. And now I ask Malka to introduce tonight's lecturer, Michael Soffer.
Thank you, Sister Barbara. Good evening and welcome. My name is Dr. Malka Zeiger-Simkovich, and I would like to thank you for attending this evening's lecture, the 3rd and final event of our annual Holocaust Education series, which takes place every May. Tonight's talk, The Holocaust in the Classroom, History, Activism, and Upstanding, will be delivered by Mr. Mike Soffer. A veteran teacher at Oak Park and River Forest High School in Oak Park, Illinois, Mr. Soffer is a graduate of Brandeis University and received his MA in literature from DePaul University. He has developed curriculum for the College Board's AP US History program, the Newberry Library, the Chicago Jewish Historical Society, and Northwestern University's Center for Talent Development. In addition to developing curriculum, Mr. Soffer has taught courses which include US history, psychology, sports and resistance in American history, and Holocaust studies, which we will hear more about this evening. We will leave time at the end of this lecture for discussion, so please reserve your questions for the end of the hour, at which time we will invite you to use the hand raise feature or to put your questions into the chat. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Mike Soffer.
Thank you so much. It's really humbling to be here, and Dr. Simkovich, thank you so much for this program and for bringing me here. I want to start before kind of anything else by putting you, it's Saturday morning, you're the superintendent of a large public high school district in suburban Chicago, and you're in your office. Before you start your workday, you sit down to read the paper. And you see a familiar name as you open the Chicago Sun-Times. You see this article down here on page 7, and the name looks familiar. It's your head custodian. He's being accused of having been in the SS, having been a guard at a concentration camp. What do you do? So this is a real story from our high school. And it's how I start our Holocaust Studies class on the first day. And from the get-go, students are yelling at each other and passionately saying, he's got to go. I don't know, maybe we need to forgive him. It's been a long time. He was only 19. And it's really a fascinating question, right? It gets at the heart of a series of human issues. After a couple minutes of letting them yell, I pause and I start asking them questions. How much does individual responsibility, how much does he have? Do we fault him? Is this comparable to Americans who ushered Japanese Americans into internment camps, or Vietnam soldiers who massacred villages? Do we want to hold him entirely responsible for what happened? He was 19, it was 40 years ago. He'd grown up in Breslau, one of the most kind of Nazi supporting cities in Europe. On the other hand, right, he volunteered to be in the SS. He was an armed guard at Gross Rosen, one of the most brutal camps in the Nazi system. 40,000 people died there. He got promoted twice. What kind of things do you have to do to get promoted at a concentration camp? And we start thinking about these issues on the first day. And I asked them two questions, right? What do you already know that would help you answer this question? And what do you need to know to answer the question? And the list of what they need to know to fully answer the question gets really long. What was Gross Rosen? What did it mean to be in the SS? And we kind of pause, right, and reflect on this idea. How can we be so impassioned and so sure of ourselves, and then very quickly realize how little we know? And that's where we start. This course developed out of a pretty rough patch in our school. We had, in the fall of 2018, we had a series of hate crimes on campus. So much so that there was a joke in the faculty copy room. We would brag, it's been 4 days since we've had a hate crime. Only a few of them made the press, but we had dozens in the classroom and in the bathroom and on sheds. There was a swastika found in the school lobby the year before, and racial slurs on a church across the street from us. In the fall of 2018, our school was on TV. There was a show about our school called America to Me. And we think kind of that brought it to the fore, but we had racist graffiti found on a shed by the school, more graffiti found in bathrooms, kind of all throughout the fall of 2018. They were poorly drawn swastikas. We had white power, homophobic, Islamophobic, anti-Black racist, antisemitic, white power, right? All sorts of things like that. This is concurrent with the attack in Pittsburgh. And then at an assembly about all of this, a student airdropped a swastika onto thousands of phones. And so we had this acute situation at our school. And the school really struggled to figure out how to respond. The administration talked about how bigotry, right, broadly was wrong, but struggled to call out anti-Semitism particularly and specifically. And as we got talking, it seemed that there was a lot of ignorance about the Holocaust. And it turns out, right, Americans, we really don't know much about the Holocaust. My students certainly did. And if, reading the debates about this custodian, this kula, that had been long true in our town. And that didn't stop us from having passionate opinions. And the data that's emerged in the last few years about our awareness of the Holocaust was really striking. Nationally, we're a little bit better than in the rest of the world, but somewhere around 54% of people in a large survey done by the Anti-Defamation League were aware of the Holocaust. And in certain regions of the world, just awareness dropped to only a quarter of people. And in particular, young people were not aware of the Holocaust. 2/3 of people had either never heard of the Holocaust or didn't believe information about it to be accurate. And young Americans in particular struggled with Holocaust awareness. Looking at young people, 2/3 didn't know that 6 million were murdered. 48% could not name a single concentration camp. If they could name Auschwitz, but almost nothing else. 11% of young Americans believe that Jews caused the Holocaust. And at least half of all young Americans have seen Holocaust denial online. And this was really troubling. And it was troubling not only because I was a teacher at this school that was having these specific acute problems, and right, I'm a parent of Jewish children, so it was scary in that regard as well. But it also, I thought, reflected a larger problem that we have about kind of our struggles as a society to kind of grapple with antipathy towards the other. And so I thought, kind of in the wake of these moments, that Holocaust education was a way to solve both our acute problem in our high school and this larger struggle that we have in educating kids to be not just not bigoted, but to be upstanders and to stand up for others. One of the things that really struck me that fall was hearing students say how few people had come up, and Jewish students saying how few people had come up and asked if they were okay. And then Black students said, yeah, that's been my experience too. And the other students saying, oh, is that something I should do, right? Like our students really didn't know, what do we do when these crises happen? And so we started putting together a Holocaust curriculum. And the kind of idea was all of the things that we want to do in a school, all the reasons we teach history, all of our goals in terms of training students to care about other people, to have empathy, we clearly weren't doing. It clearly wasn't working. And I thought a new class would work. I had a colleague who had created a course that used sports as a mechanism to teach these same ideas about equality, about resistance. And I thought if we take the ideas that we care about here, the same questions and frameworks and lessons, and we move it to Germany, to a situation that no one would get defensive about, that happened elsewhere, that was so morally black and white, we could access the same ideas that we care about, instill the same values, and move past any defensiveness that kids might have when they're kind of encountering these questions that they might encounter in American history. And these issues matter, and Holocaust consciousness matters. It turns out the Holocaust is a uniquely effective way of reducing antipathy towards the other. More than almost any other topic, the research in secondary education bears out that the Holocaust is a uniquely effective way of reducing antipathy towards the other. So for one, and it probably isn't surprising, knowledge about the Holocaust reduces anti-Semitism. It is associated, knowledge of the Holocaust is associated with lower rates of anti-Semitism specifically, but it's also associated with lower rates of bigotry more broadly. And the idea is that when kids see how things played out, right, you start to kind of understand the danger of bigotry and the danger of not standing up to it. And one of the things that I found really striking was that young people are the least likely to hold bigoted views. They were also the least likely to know about the Holocaust. And so it was this kind of clear thing that one of the things that we could do to reduce antipathy towards the other, to promote upstanding, to promote all of the moral ideas that we hope kids get in learning history, is to present it in a specific curriculum about the Holocaust. But teaching about the Holocaust has a lot of challenges. And how we frame, how we think about the class is really important. And so some of the goals and rationale for Holocaust education include using the course just as a kind of a typical mechanism for traditional educational outcomes, right? It is a deep and rich content dive into World War II. We can foster a passion for learning about the past and develop critical thinking skills. But it also can be a mechanism for improving our cognitive skills and hard empathy, and showing the stakes of collaborating, of bystanding, and of upstanding. one of the things that we focus on, and kind of our goal in the class, is expanding the universe of obligation. So one of the things we do early on is we ask students, who are you obligated to help? So we do this is from Facing History, very easy, simple activity, but they write their name here, right? So I write Mike, and then put who you feel your greatest obligation to, right? So you put your family, I put my wife and my kids, my parents maybe, right? Out here, your next, your close friends, extended family, right? Neighbors maybe on the outside, and people who you're obligated to help in varying degrees. We do the same thing of who's obligated to help you. And one of the things that we want students to kind of understand is that this universe of obligation, this idea is kind of at the crux of how we interact with society. And our goal in this class is to show when our universe of obligation, who we feel obligated to help, is small, worse outcomes happen. And when it's expanded, right, we have better outcomes. We're more likely to stand up for other people, and other people are more likely to stand up for us. And that becomes really apparent as they study the Holocaust. When they see groups of people, and Jewish Europeans in particular, right, not being in anyone's universe of obligation, and the outcomes that result there. Other important frames as we started developing the curriculum, things that we think about largely are whether to do a Holocaust Studies course or a Genocide Studies course. We opted in our school for a Holocaust Studies course that would focus specifically on the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews, though we do spend a little bit of time talking about other genocides. My feeling is that a deep dive is always, right, more historically effective. But I was also weary of having every 2 weeks showing 15-year-old kids a different horrible thing that happened, and the toll that would take. Another issue is whether to focus particularly on the Jewish experience or more universally on the experience of non-Jews under Nazi tyranny. And this is another thing that is an important question for Holocaust education, and one that in our school, we opted to focus a lot on the Jewish experience, but to also make sure that we were looking more universally as well at the experience of other groups who were terrorized by the Nazis. And then finally, as a framing question, the question of history or studies, whether to focus just on the historical or to use techniques from other fields, literature, film, sociology, and psychology as parts of the study, and we opted for that. When we designed the class, one of the things that we wanted to keep in mind was balancing for kids what it's like to be in the class, right, and to be confronted with these really, really challenging and emotionally difficult topics. We started with our camera kind of out, looking at genocides more broadly after the Holocaust. And I thought it was important for students to know that this phrase that we hear, right, never again, they've continued happening. And so we start by looking at what constitutes a genocide. What does it mean that they've continued happening, and why has the world, right, allowed those to happen? Then we look at the history of anti-Semitism and why Jews weren't in the universe of obligation. We look at how that developed over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years. When we look at the Nazi rise to power, we talk about to whom the Nazis would have appealed, and why more Germans weren't put off by it. What does it mean for an entire country to seemingly turn evil overnight? And so we switch right from the bigotry of anti-Semitism to a more political history piece. And we also talk about, like, why do ideologies like Nazism, why do they appeal to everyday middle-class people? We then look at the actual Holocaust, right, the actual genocide. And here is, I think, a really important thing to kind of mention, that the actual genocide is really, really difficult for high school students to talk about and to think about. And so it's a really difficult thing, but it's obviously vital if we're going to be talking about these kinds of things for kids to understand for kids to understand exactly, right, what happened in the camps. And so we've studied the history of it. In the second half of the class, we spend a lot of our focus dealing on kind of interpreting those moments. So one of the next things that we do is we look at the nature of evil. What does it mean to have this society, have this happen? And so we look at the social scientists, particularly psychologists, who in the aftermath of the war try and explain what happened. And so we look at Milgram and obedience studies, we look at Solomon Asch and conformity studies, studies about bystander effect, and start kind of thinking about this question of the soldiers' defense that soldiers gave after the war in the Nuremberg trials. And our students evaluate whether they're convinced and what is the role of the individual. We also look at Holocaust denial and think about, right, how we question it. One of the last things that we do is we look at questions of justice and forgiveness and vengeance and Nazi hunting. And that becomes fun for kids, right? Thinking about those kind of spy thriller ideas, but we're really looking at these big weighty issues. And as much as we're talking about the Holocaust in any of these, all of these have these very clear and present ramifications for our society today. When we look at the history of anti-Semitism, what we're really asking is, how do certain groups become othered? How do groups become outside of that universe of obligation? And we start to understand that a bigotry is an idea, right? That a series of ideas that are constructed. And so we start talking about as well racism in American history and how that develops, and it becomes a way for kids to be thinking about our country too. There's obviously a lot of connection between the Jim Crow laws that we have here and some of the Nazi policies and Nuremberg laws, the disenfranchisement of sections of society. And so kids can see those connections. When we look at the how the Nazis and why the Nazis come to power, we're talking about the fragility of democracy, questions that our students are thinking about today. And when we're thinking about to whom the Nazis would have appealed, why do these scary ideologies, why do they appeal to someone? And these are things that our school, which is about 40% minority, these are issues that are really important for them. And so by doing this deep dive into the Holocaust, we can really think about these larger questions that are really important to our kids. And so ultimately, right, what we want them to do is say, okay, like, what can I do? And so I think it's important then to pause and talk about what Holocaust studies isn't. I think there's a notion that the reason that you teach, that we teach in schools, in public schools about the Holocaust is this idea of never again, right? That Holocaust education exists so that genocides won't happen again. But that seems deep. I guess as a show of hands, how many of you have been asked to participate in a genocide and had to weigh the decision of what to do? It's not a question I've ever come across, right? Nobody's ever said like, hey, Mike, like, it's not a question that our students are going to confront in that kind of explicit manner. Certainly it happens, right? There have been dozens of genocides since 1945, but I'd like to aim higher for my students than having them not participate in genocides. I have higher expectations for them than that. There's also some trite lessons about the Holocaust, right? I had some colleagues, right, who were talking about it, and there are in some of our schools in our district essays that kids are asked to write that say, what is the most important lesson to draw from the Holocaust? And I really balk at that, right? What is it's inexplicable. The kind of one of the best primers on the Holocaust is a book called How Is It Possible? The book leaves the question unanswered, and it's 1,400 pages, right? These are not, there's no simple takeaway of this is the lesson. There isn't some kind of moral singular lesson to derive. If anything, it would be that the human capacity for evil is limitless, and that's not the kind of idea I want to, uplifting idea I want to center for 15 and 16-year-olds. So in our class, instead, we talk about the universe of obligation. What can we do? And I don't think that they, we stress like you're not responsible for fixing everything, right? But how can we expand our universe of obligation, and how can we help make the world a little bit of a better and safer place? So I want to show you some examples of ways in which this manifests in our classroom. One of the kind of common myths about the Holocaust is about American involvement and American uninvolvement. And it's an idea that we must not have known. The United States must not have known what was happening. Otherwise, obviously, we would have stopped it. The reality is, from the very beginning of Hitler's reign, the American press is covering in detail what the Nazis are doing. Danny Green, who is from Northwestern and is the president of the Newberry Library, has some great scholarship on this through the Holocaust Museum. But he's put together all of these articles that show that the United States, we were reporting it, right? It's just a few weeks after Hitler's come to power. New York Times in 1938. When Kristallnacht happens, it's front page in every newspaper in the country for weeks. The issue wasn't that the American press ignored the Holocaust. It was there. The question we want to ask, and that my students we ask, is why didn't the reporting have more of an impact? So we can see, there's already estimates in 1942 that 7 million Jews, the 2 million have already been killed, another 5 million. There's already estimates that 7 million Jews are going to be killed. And Reader's Digest, these are popular, right? Things that people would have been reading. What's interesting, though, is that the reporting doesn't affect people's attitudes. Right? Do you think it was a good idea for Hitler to take away the power of the Jews? Right? Only 60% of Americans are sure that it was. This is 1942. And the other thing that's wild is wartime attitudes towards Jews in the United States actually worsen. Do you think Jews have too much power and influence in the country? Yes, 45%, then 50%, then 56%. As the war goes on, as the Holocaust is raging through Europe, the issue is not that Americans don't know. They're not impacted by that. And so my students take this stance and they're like, well, that's terrible. Like we were terrible. And so I kind of pause and say like, okay, tell me, do you guys know what's going on in China right now, or what's going on in Syria right now? And a couple kids say, yeah. And I say, okay, what did you do today to stop it? And it's a completely unfair question. They're 16. But to this larger point of it's really, really easy to look at something and say that that's bad, but to then be driven to a place of I want to do something about it. And so it's important for us to kind of instill that humility. Here in the United States, obviously, there were larger issues that are happening that maybe a larger story about American anti-Semitism and things like that. But for our students, right, to say we have this, Dr. Simkovich and I both have Brandeis degrees. Brandeis is kind of famed for saying sunlight is the best disinfectant, and maybe it's not, right? Maybe knowing that something bad is happening is not enough, right? We need to kind of be driven to have empathy for the person who's in suffering and for the person who's being hurt. We need to have kind of a sense that matters to us, right? And that we feel it too. We need to kind of expand our universe of obligation, and clearly kind of Americans didn't. And even after the war, we really balk at taking in refugees. Our refugee policies in the 10, 15 years after the war actually allow in more Nazi perpetrators than you'd imagine. They gave significantly easier access to former Nazi collaborators to get into the United States than to the victims of the Nazis. We prioritized, we prioritized the murderers, not the survivors. And so that's one of the kind of ways that we can say this is how it played out when we didn't care about other people. The other way that we do this is by teaching through stories. And so one of the things we do in the last 5 minutes of class every day, we tell the story of two families and their experiences in the Holocaust. And so one of them is a Polish family named the Posalskos. And so we tell the story of this family and give an update at the end of class every day. Unrelated to whatever we've been talking about, but we see them experience poverty in the small town in Poland. We see the Nazis take over and they're sent to the Lodz ghetto. We see the ghetto being liquidated eventually. The ghetto here. We see them on the Lodz ghetto census and then being sent to death camps. We see and learn stories of some of the family members being murdered right in front of the others. And we see the story of two of the daughters surviving. And when we do see them survive, we see them do it through really unique ways. One of them here, you can see this is her actual birth date. And then you can see on various documents that she gives in displaced persons camps, she changes her birth date, she makes herself younger. And in doing so, makes herself a minor. She was in her 20s, but she makes herself a minor. And that allows her to get into the United States with the help of the United States Catholic Charities. And so we tell this story and kids are watching the Holocaust happen to a family. And they're, when they find out that the camp has been liberated, Auschwitz has been liberated and Sarah has survived, kids are like, cheering, right? Because we're invested in the story of the individual and we build up empathy, right? When we hear that story, we build up empathy. And we also challenge myths about, there's ideas out there that Jews just went like lambs to the slaughter, and they see stories of resistance. They see something as simple as lying on her about her birth date allowed her to get into the United States. And we follow another story of a Berkowitz family, and the oldest son sent to mandatory Palestine and in 1935 and never sees his family again. We then follow these stories as these two families, right as the war ends, and they see that the Sarah and the oldest, the child from the Berkowitz family, they end up getting married. And I reveal over time that this is my wife's family. And this is right, my kids' great grandparents, and that these stories are with us. What I think is really important too is this is not something that they would necessarily know, right? From being having me as their teacher. There's a lot of us have stories like this that are really impactful on how we experience the world, but nobody would know, right? And so kids start sharing that their family were refugees from some other place, and or their family had been enslaved here, and how that has impacted them, right? And it becomes this way that kids are sharing their own family stories, the stories that impact how they show up and how they experience the world. And they're building empathy for each other and thinking about, what does it mean that this was how your family experienced the world? This is how your family, right, comes here, and the stories that it brings. And how does that affect how you experience the same kind of things that we're going through together today? And I think that that's a really important thing for our students to take a step back too, and they're going to see connections, interethnic connections, similar experiences. And again, we go back to the universe of obligation, right? And talk about how we can build up empathy for the other. One of my favorite days in the class is the day where we don't speak. We talk instead, or we learn instead about upstanders. Every kid encounters somebody who saved people during the war, who hid Jews or forged passports or things like that. And so on the first of these 2 days, students just spend the day reading about and learning about one of these upstanders. The next day, in small groups, they share out their person and they talk about what they had in common, right? Who are the heroes of these stories? It's great to have empathy for for the victims, right? That's kind of an easy thing to do, but it's really important to use as models. Who are the people who are the heroes of these stories? Who are the upstanders? Who are the resistors? And so they talk about what they have in common. Often, but not always, the upstanders were religious. Most typically, they saved people they knew, neighbors, colleagues, customers, friends, people in their universe of obligation. And so they start kind of building up a profile of these upstanders, right? And I think that it's really, really helpful to show them models of these are the kinds of people who, in the face of these really difficult circumstances, who rose to the occasion. And we do that before we talk about the collaborators and the perpetrators. Kids, right, we talk about in the psychology of genocide, one of the things that we talk about is how difficult it would have been to overcome your circumstance, right? If you are raised with Nazi propaganda and you know, there's pressure to conform, pressure to obey, it might be really, really hard to expect you to be an upstander. And yet people did. And kind of similarly here, I want my students to say, like, even in situations where it's hard to be an upstander, I know that it's possible, right? People have done it. But we do also talk about the perpetrators. And when we created the class, there was consensus among, I had a kind of team of colleagues who helped create it, and there was a lot of consensus about kind of how things should be structured and things like that. The one issue where there was really heated debate, people were like not speaking to each other for a few days, was over the question of how do we frame discussions about the perpetrators? The really questions, right, about the nature of evil. Some folks on the team wanted to discuss the historical and psychological milieu that would have made it difficult for a kind of everyday middle-class German to look at a Jew and said, like, I'm going to have your back. But there was a question of, will that come off to kids as if we're excusing
Mike, we're having a bit of a hard time here.
using those kind of beliefs and those kind of behaviors. And it was, I'm sorry?
Mike, can you repeat the past 30 seconds because you froze, and maybe just stand a little bit more like in the middle of your computer? I'm sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Much better.
Okay. So we had a lot of tension about how we framed discussions about the nature and the decisions that people made. I think it's really important for us to have empathy, not sympathy, but empathy for the perpetrators, to think about what it is that they would have experienced, right? Because we want to make sure that we understand where those kind of problematic ideas come from. So one of the things that we do is we think about to whom Nazism would have appealed and why. How could they have overlooked the obviously horrible aspects of it? The biggest predictor of whether the Nazis would have had success in a particular city was the level of unemployment. And so we talk about, right, what does that mean? What does that tell us about our society today? And right, so we start looking at profiles of German voters and thinking about who they would have been attracted to, which political party in Nazi elections they would have been, in German elections they would have been kind of attracted to. And I think that this is a really important piece to have. And so we look at these profiles and think about who they would have voted for. And then at the end, and this is actually what we did today, we do a simulation of what happened at our high school. And we look back at—
The video has stopped.
I'm so sorry, is it, am I back?
I see the video.
Okay.
So I'm not sure. Just you're coming in and out a little bit, so
Okay.
It's difficult for us to solve that. But maybe if you just, I think when you're speaking a little bit closer to your window, it's a little bit better. Thank you.
Okay. My apologies.
No, you're fine. Thank you so much.
So we end our class by coming back to the story of this guard that and asking if you had been the school board as these deportation hearings are being adjudicated, what would you have done? Because these raise the same kind of questions that we want kids to think about. Can a person change? What does forgiveness mean? What does justice look like? And so we end the class by simulating the board meetings that they would have gone through. And I think it's a really, really important exercise to think about where do we go from here, right? What is justice? What is forgiveness? And so I think Holocaust education has a lot of difficulties, right, in how we frame it, but it has the potential to really affect how we see others, reduce antipathy to others, to help kids see the stakes involved when we do little things to help other people or when we don't.